Hey, this is Mark Ray.
And Zach DeJarle.
And welcome back to EdTech Remix. Today we are going to be talking about another of the ISTE standards, also the Washington State Educational Technology Standards. We're going to be looking at Innovative Designer today, which I'm pretty excited about. We've got a great guest today. Cyndy Hagin is going to be joining us here in just a few minutes. She rocks the design world. She's doing some amazing things with robotics and design and such. And I guess, so, we keep talking about like the good old days. So when you were a kid, what were some things that you designed? Either at school or at home?
That's a funny question. I remember in sixth grade, my neighbor, I lived on the farm, and so there was, neighbors was a mile away. Neighbor, right?
Because you grew up in Idaho?
In Idaho, yep. And so John and I were best friends growing up, just out of lack of other options. But we were good friends, and we built we didn't build nothing. We tried to build a go-kart.
Of course.
So we had an old lawnmower engine, and then we had this like sawhorse that was super long. It was my dad's, and he used it all the time. And we thought if we just drilled 2 holes into it on each side, we could put the wheels on it. There were scooter wheels actually on them. We had 2 scooters we took apart for that.
I can see this. I can visually see this. I'm not sure where the engine's going to go.
I don't think we do either. But I thought, my dad wouldn't mind, because then at least his sawhorse would be on wheels and it'd be easier to move. So even if this didn't work out, but there's a thing called an axle that we didn't have or even think to plan for. Yeah. So wheels need something to spin around in that sense. Yeah. So I remember trying to do that. That was
so you just attach the wheels
to the edge of the sawhorses. Yeah. We didn't get very far. We had a seat.
So it skidded really well. Yeah.
I remember John and I too. Another time we built. There was those all-you-can-eat buffets at the mall in Coeur d'Alene. So us to go to one of those was a big deal, right?
Wait. I just don't know where this story's going to go, but I'm excited.
And so my mom was complaining one day. She had these tools in the house in one of our closets, and they were just all over the place, just complaining. So John and I had the idea that if we built her a toolbox, she'd be able to take us to this all-you-can-eat buffet that we've been wanting to go to. Connection there? I don't know. We just thought it would work out.
So child logic.
Yeah, so we go out to build this toolbox out of wood, and we had some plywood that I cut up, and she said it was fine. Again, my dad was at work, so he didn't know yet. And as long as we didn't use any power tools, that was kind of the one little caveat. And so we built this toolbox. She still has it to this day. It works, but it is so kind of just janky off to the side. It doesn't sit flat. It kind of rocks. It has one side's bigger than the other side. It has a bar that goes across it that we screwed it into there, and the bar is like at a, I don't know,
kind of for the handle.
20-degree angle. It's not straight across. So
but you still have it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So you kept it just as a pride?
No, my mom kept that. She liked it, so she
really
made it very special for us. Yes,
that's pretty darn cool. Yeah. When I was growing up, I was a Lego geek, and I had the luck of having an amazing collection of Legos that I pretty much had pillaged. I think from my brother also at some point got Legos, but I just kept kind of requisitioning them, and suddenly they were mine. So I was able to. For years, I would just go down to the basement, and I had a whole place where I could set up a Legoland, and I just designed stuff, all things like crazy. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and the Lego people were there, and everyone got a little kit, and so they gave these pieces that I've got. This is actually, I bring some evidence of my design. This is not as cool as your toolkit.
It might be more functional.
It's certainly more colorful. But anyway, so they just gave us these little pieces, and then they invited us to design whatever we wanted to. And so I'm not sure why I designed it, but anyway, I thought, I need to make something functional. So I have this. So we have these little guys in there, and it looks like it's just kind of cute. You've got the guy with the little wand and the other guy with the thing, but it's actually functional, because if you pop these guys backwards like that, then it becomes a functional phone holder.
I love it.
There we go. And then you see you've got the guys back there and
holding that phone up.
Yep. They're just holding on for dear life. And I had to go through a couple of design steps to figure out to make sure it didn't tip over. But I've had that on my desk ever since.
That's awesome.
I'm not sure if it's good or not, but I'm sure that Cyndy will put us to shame when she talks about some of the things that she does with kids. So this standard is the standard is described as students use a variety of technologies within a design process to identify and solve problems by creating new, useful, and imaginative solutions.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing a couple of things. I know that obviously we've already talked about the EdTech standards. Technology is always part of it because it's ISTE standards. But design process and this idea of imaginative solutions, new, useful, and imaginative solutions. That's something I remember doing stuff again as in school as a kid.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if they were necessarily. I don't think there was a really formal design process.
Yeah,
I don't remember that anyway.
I think I may have said this about each one of the standards, but this one
Is it
particular.
gonna be a Bob Saget story?
No, this is not. I'm not going there this time. No, this is a. I like this.
We
one.
love you, Bob Saget. Don't worry. It's like
This might be my favorite in the sense that it's so important. It isn't anything that we were actually assessing in a qualitative way or quantitative way necessarily, but it's something our kids need.
Yeah.
A lot of, more of.
Yeah.
And the design process itself, I think, is there's lots of different ways to go through that. This morning I spent the morning at one of our elementary schools, kind of being. And I wasn't really a judge. It was for a STEM.
It was
fair.
a STEM thing. Yeah. That's right.
And so I got to hear these. I think I did 9 presentations where they came in and they had a question they were going through, and while they called it a STEM fair, in reality, what they were doing is going through the design process, coming up with this question, doing the research, and then they would go to a spot where they would try to either build something that would solve that solution, and then iterate over and over until they got a product they wanted to share, and listening to those 4th and 5th graders talk about the design process, and they would never call it that. They were just the process they went through, But it was so powerful, so much ownership that they had in those projects.
Yeah, and that authenticity, I think, is the other thing that's kind of a little bit different. I mean, I remember doing experiments and build things and stuff at school, but they really weren't authentic. They weren't based on like a real problem or anything based in kind of real space, and it was a little fake, I guess, for lack of a better term. Yeah. I do remember though we did the science fairs.
Oh
Did
yeah,
you do the science
fairs?
Yeah. It was that was keen competition. But I remember my experiments were dumb. It's like there was no design. There was no design whatsoever there.
Well, and those experiences are so important for our kids. They remember them.
Yeah.
All the learning that happens in those types of experience isn't something that could be identified in a standard, and that's one of the reasons I like this, is they start to pull out very specifics that we can identify as a need and a standard that they need in as they move forward in their education as well as in their career.
Yeah, and you mentioned before this, I mean, the idea of students owning the process and being connected to that. I mean, we've talked about that in almost all of the standards. That's been a recurring theme, and also that idea of students failing and iterating and evolving their thinking in terms of their designs, which is, again, we've heard that again and again.
And I think even that one, I love how the ISTE standards has a spirit of that. Like it's okay to fail and continue to move forward and try and learn from those failures and move forward. I don't know if that was the spirit of my education. I missed it.
Yeah,
I missed that one. Everything was very much right and wrong, and if it's wrong, then that's bad. And of course, I learned from those failures, but that was never celebrated, I guess.
And I had a couple teachers that were Mr. Peterson. I can think of a couple of others that I think did embrace that, but it wasn't. I don't think it was the norm at the time.
Sure.
I think they were ahead of their time. Either that or fish out of water, one of those things. So we've got a great guest with us today, and we'll be bringing her on here next, and she'll talk a little bit about some of the things that she's doing with design with students.
All right.
Hey, we're back. Zach, you want to introduce our guest?
Absolutely. So, Cyndy, would you maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you've been teaching, what you're doing recently, anything like that the audience here might want to know about?
Sure. I'm Cyndy Hagin. I currently teach at ISTE Prep, which is a 6 through 12 STEM school. I teach robotics and computer science.
Okay.
This is my 22nd or 23rd year teaching. I taught at Discovery Middle School.
We taught together there. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I taught at McLaughlin Middle School. Taught up north for a little while. Came back.
Okay.
I like up north.
Well, a couple places, Puyallup, South Kitsap.
Sure. So today we're going to go through a few of the indicators to the Innovative Designer ISTE standard. So Mark and I will kind of go back and forth. We'll read the indicator and then see what either comments or insights you might have from your own experience or experience in the classroom.
Great.
Okay. So the first one is students know and use a deliberate design process for generating ideas, testing theories, creating innovative artifacts, or solving authentic problems.
There's not much there.
I know, right?
Gotta pack that
It's a
one
big
up,
one.
yeah.
That's basically the design process.
Yes.
That pretty much covers it. And at ITech, since we're project-based, we are constantly using the design process. They use it in every single class at some point. In general, you're identifying the criterion constraints.
Yeah.
You are brainstorming solutions. You're doing research. You're sketching out your ideas. Then you're choosing your best idea. And then you go through the prototyping process, testing, redesigning until you have the final product. And then you always want to communicate your results and present.
Sure. So at iTech, you've got, I mean, that's kind of your focus. You have a design kind of ethos, I guess, for the instruction. So scrolling back to when you were a teacher in other settings, was that also part of the instruction that took place, or is that unique to iTech?
No, the design process is the design process. So I use that at home when I'm designing something that I'm building a shelf or even a recipe.
A toolbox.
A toolbox.
A toolbox.
Yes.
Pretty much anything. So and it may have less research, depending on what it is that I'm doing. But if I'm trying to build a bookshelf or something like that, I would definitely want to do some research. And I have criterion constraints in that where is this going to go? What is it going to hold? Yeah. All of those things. So
do the kids come to you with that skill set, or is that something that
they do? But it has to be pointed out to them.
Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was kind of what I was thinking too. Is how do when students come into your classroom and kind of go through this process, how explicit is that to them, and how do they jump right into it and it's simple and it's easy to adapt, or is it a big learning curve?
I think they jump right into it to a certain extent. The fine tuning the process is the tricky part, but they've all done it. You just have to point out to them, you were actually doing this when you did that.
Sure.
So this is a kind of a introductory question, but I imagine maybe a few people that are listening or viewing, the very few people that will be viewing or listening to this, are wondering, are there different design processes, or is there just kind of a standard, you just said that, well, that's just the design process, but are there different design processes?
I think the process is the same.
The steps.
The steps are the same, and some, you could have three, which is kind of understanding what you're doing, the brainstorming, and then the actual doing. There's 6-step processes, there's 12-step processes, but they all have the same components.
Okay. Okay. And then I'm sorry to ask a kind of a geeky question, but there's there's this term called what's the new thing that's the design it's like
design thinking,
and how is that different, or is that just the same thing?
I think
Thanks for helping me.
I think that design thinking is the application of the design process in different arenas. And so it's something, again, that we all do. We just don't think of it that way. But if you start thinking and applying those same steps to other things, then you're using design thinking in other ways.
That helps.
That's interesting. I was at a STEM fair this morning, and my kids are actually part of it as well. I didn't get to judge their projects, but
that's probably why.
Yeah, that's probably why.
You had to recuse yourself.
I did. So I have 2 4th graders have been kind of struggling through this process, and they call it a STEM fair, but essentially they are going through the design process, right? And they know it frontwards and backwards, but they don't know the names of the steps or real, intentional. But the outcome of going through that process, I think, it's so impactful and important to their learning, and I just loved it. I loved every bit of it for them.
Yeah, awesome.
So the next standard is 4B, which is students select and use digital tools to plan and manage a design process that considers design constraints and calculated risks. So specifically, it sounds to me like they're kind of focusing on in what ways does digital enhance the design process? So how do you use digital tools in your design process, or is it
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I rolled out digital tools in my high school classes, and have been using that more with them and with my competition robotics teams. Next year, plan to unleash it at the middle school level.
Cool.
We started at the high school with Smartsheet, which is something that our own architecture department, that's not the correct name for that, but facilities planning. Facilities and planning department uses, where you can kind of keep track of your tasks and who's working on the tasks and due dates for tasks and things like that. And it automatically produces Gantt and PERT charts. And students enjoyed using that. We actually had Jennifer come out to our classes and show how it was being used
Jennifer's
for current
from the planning department.
Planning department.
Yeah.
And show and she was able to show current projects and the smart sheets that they have. Was introduced after that to Trello, which kind of allows you to do a Kanban sheet.
Okay, so what's a Kanban?
So Kanban is kind of like if you have Post-it notes or something like that in columns. So this is my to-do list, and I have all of these to-dos, and I can assign each of those to-dos to a given person, or say all three of us need to work on that, and you can set up the columns that you want, and then you just move things. And then you can move it to a completed column once it's complete. It has due dates on there. It can send reminders. People can ask questions of the other teammates. Everybody has access to it.
So it's kind of Google Docs, again, acknowledging I don't know anything about this, it's kind of Google Docs for kind of project management design process.
It's more of a project management tool than a Google
But you have the
Doc
collaborative
tool.
Capabilities.
Right,
can see it
but yes.
We just come across that with our team, and so there will be 10 of us now working on our team next year, and we just started using Trello to plan our projects for next year. It's interesting that came up. It's been phenomenal so far.
And I was talking to my husband about it, who's in the business world, and he said, "Oh yeah, we may start using that."
Yeah.
And students are choosing to use it once they've been taught. They're choosing to use it for different things, which is great to see how they're using that application in other areas of their curricular careers.
And the great thing about that is that something that's both those tools are used in the marketplace or in industry. So it's not that you're creating something abstract for the classroom. You're actually using real world tools.
Right. And you mentioned Google Docs, and I've introduced Agile development and Scrum meetings to my high school students, and they're using those and then posting those notes on those in a Google Doc that everybody has access to, so everyone can kind of go back and revisit where were we and where are we now.
Okay, so just because I know that there's at least one other person listening to this that doesn't know what a Scrum meeting is or Agile, whatever it was, so can you explain those just briefly to us?
Sure.
I'm learning so much in this book. It's like we're realizing just how stupid I am. I just know nothing. Anyway,
you're not stupid. Yeah. You just haven't been introduced to it yet.
I just know my bag. Anyway.
Yeah, and I hadn't either until I attended a conference this summer.
Do share.
So the Scrum meeting, and you can do it every day. You can do it once a week, and different teams at the high school are doing it differently. But it's basically a way for you to check in with everyone on your team and say, what have you accomplished since last time we met? What are you planning to accomplish, and are you blocked by anything? So everyone in the group, it's not to suggest things, or it's just to get a quick check. Where is everyone on your progress? And then if somebody is blocked by something, who can help you with that blockage? And that may be, we need to get Ms. Hagin involved, or that may be, see me after the meeting. I've got an idea for you.
And that's Agile design as well. You said Agile.
That's part of Agile development, right? So it's just kind of,
Okay, so I've done that before. I just didn't call it.
You just didn't call it a Scrum meeting.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I can just throw that one down.
Exactly.
I'm a little bit interested on that one, on that particular indicator when it talks about calculated risks. So how do you handle that with students? They are students, so we have to. I always think of like when it's okay to fail, but then we always have to kind of put some guards or supports around that too. So with the calculated risk, I'm curious about that one.
Sure. So we can talk about the project that we just completed at the middle school. So when you're identifying your criterion constraints and students are starting to design things, you always have students who are shooting for exceeding standards. And you have to start having conversations with them. So what's our time frame? Is that realistic in the time frame that we're working on here?
Okay.
And talking about that, and then you have their desire to continue to do, and say, okay, well, I'm going to make sure I have this and this and this, and I'm going to work on this, if I can. And then you have the students who just go for the calculated, the risk. They know it's risky. They know that they may not finish the project, even though you've advised them, can we get minimum viable product here first, and then start working on these things, and they just want to go for it, and maybe they don't actually meet standard then because they've bitten off more than they can chew. So.
And is that acceptable failure for students? So, I mean, what does that look like in terms of the conversation after that? So, as a teacher, they bite off too much. They bit off more than they can chew.
Sure.
So, and they don't complete the task or the project or whatever. What's the conversation with a student like in that situation?
So that's where reflection comes in.
Okay.
So, and with this last project, we've talked a lot about minimum viable product. So that doesn't necessarily meet standard, but what is the very bare minimum that you absolutely need to have to be at least meeting somewhat of an expectation for this?
Okay.
And so we constantly talked about that. And so, did you have minimum viable product? Fortunately, I only had one group that didn't have minimum viable product, which was awesome. But then you can talk about why were you not at meeting standard? What got in the way of that? What would you do differently next time?
Would that have occurred at the beginning? So you're at the end of the school year now,
right?
So would that, I guess, success rate be the same at the beginning of the year, or is that something that develops? So in other words, is that a sign of progress with your students and with
it's yes, absolutely. Okay. And we just introduced the minimum viable product for this particular project at the end of the school year. So we kept kind of talking about that and making sure that they knew exactly what they absolutely had to have. But it was definitely different at the beginning of the year. Okay. But then after every project, we always reflected, what would you do differently next time? Did you meet standard? If you didn't, why not? If you exceeded standard, is there anything that you would have done differently?
The cool thing about that, I think about in terms of transferability to other subjects, I'm kind of geeking out on this, I'm sorry.
We're all geeks here. It's okay.
It's a geek safe space. Is just that, that reflection and that critical examination. I don't know that happens outside of robotics classrooms or shop classrooms or those. Maybe I'm just mistaken on that, but I'm thinking from social studies or English, why did you epically fail on that, that 5-paragraph paper?
I think that they do at ITech, and maybe
because that's part of the structure.
Maybe that's part of the structure.
Yeah.
I do it as a teacher. At the end of every day, at the end of every lesson. I mean, sometimes within the day, and I teach third period, and at fourth period is the same. And how I delivered something just really didn't resonate with the students, and so I'm thinking on the fly, how can I make this better? So I mean, I think we all reflect. They have a more formal process to do, but
interesting.
So let's jump into the next indicator. It says students develop, test, and refine prototypes as a part of cyclical design process.
That is students' favorite part.
Okay.
They would skip over the identifying criterion constraints and
Jump
the research and the sketching and the decision matrix. They will skip that every single time.
Meetings. I don't want a scrum meeting. I want to do that.
Well, the scrum meetings happen while you're building, so but that's the fun part. And the developing, testing, refining. Different students have more resiliency as far as that is concerned. We start the year, at least in my class, at the beginning of the year, I have the quote from Honda up on my wall: "Success is 99% failure." I say you're going to fail a lot in here, so just be ready, and it's okay because that's part of the design process. And for the most part, students work their way through it. Yeah. So it's.
Well, and there's so much. Mark and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. There's so much learning that happens in that spot. In my experience growing up and going my K-12 education, I don't know if that was accepted. And so maybe that's either my experience or it's changed a lot since then. But it seems to be a spirit that is okay. And those are teachable moments, and we want to capture those. And even I see my own kids now. I had 5 kids, and as they learn and grow and go through our K-12 system, I'm starting to see that more and more with their own teachers.
That's a good sign.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, I agree. I had the same experience. Yeah. I don't think that it was acceptable. Yeah. Well, it was when I was outside of school. Sure. Because I was following the design process and failing as part of the design process. Yeah. But in school, I think you're right. I think that it didn't used to be as acceptable.
So I guess the lesson here with innovative design, I think a lot of people could look at this standard and say this doesn't apply to me in a social studies situation, or I'm a math teacher, I don't have to worry about this kind of stuff. And based on what we're talking about, I mean, I would love to be in your class, and maybe next year I'll just volunteer.
I would love to be in my class as a student and be able to do the fun stuff.
But again, the transferability of kind of that process and that thinking and that ethos that's in your classroom, again, if that can be transferred to every classroom in our district or in the schools, would be just a pretty amazing thing. Yeah. So our last standard is 4D, which is students exhibit a tolerance for ambiguity, perseverance, and the capacity to work with open-ended problems. And you already alluded to perseverance a little bit when you were talking earlier. So this is kind of those, so to speak, soft skills, I guess, that you talk about. So, I mean, what do you see then in the projects that you do as far as how that applies?
Grit shows up in many different ways. Perseverance, in the design process, being able to fail and being okay with that, and redesigning and redesigning again and redesigning again and redesigning again, and maybe having to totally redesign everything. Some students are better at that than others, obviously, and some students are learning how to, okay, when I get really frustrated with this, I just need to step back. I'm going to go over and help that group right now. And then maybe that'll make me feel better. And then I'll come back and be able to look at it with fresh eyes. Same thing happens with programming. Up at the high school, one of my groups had a programming issue, and none of us could solve it. I was looking at it going, I don't know why that's not working. And we all 3 just were looking at it. And then one of the students says, well, what if we did this? I was like, awesome suggestion. What would that look like in code? And so, I mean, they just kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. And then we finally figured it out, and it worked like a charm. So I think, and this kind of goes right along with the being willing to fail. Yeah. You have to be okay with that, and you have to learn how to push through. So,
and again, the same question I asked, I guess, with the first indicator is, do students come with that skill set or that habit of mind, or do they have to learn it?
Some students are, I think, naturally resilient, and so they already come with it and they apply it in all of their classes in different ways. Other students need to be given the okay to experience that. It hasn't been okay for them for whatever reason, and so they need to learn to accept initial failure and learn that it's not failure like final failure, it's initial failure, and we're going to rework it, and that's how we are successful.
Fascinating.
It is.
Like I say, I want to go to your class if for another reason.
You're welcome anytime.
If for no other reason that I would want your earrings to add to my collection here. That's minifigs. I found out that those things are called minifigs, miniature figures.
Minifigs, and anyway, I also found out during that same time one of the little knobs on a Lego is called a stud.
Yes, it's a stud.
Yes.
Yep. We did a few.
We did.
We've done a few things.
Dug into that one a little bit.
The things we learned.
I know.
So this has been just an amazing conversation. I mean, what are any monster takeaways for you, Zach?
I know as both an educator, but I always see this through a lens at the same time of having 5 kids, and they're all young, and seeing them grow up and have some of these experiences. That last indicator when it talks about grit and perseverance, and that's what my kids need. That's what all kids need. But as a parent too, seeing them and struggling, everything in life, learning, there's all these difficulties will come up to. So those are the type of skills that will benefit them across discipline, experiences, and I appreciate that a lot of our teachers, whether they know it or not, are teaching and embracing that, and I can't speak enough for my oldest son had a really tough time reading, and he stuck after it, and he had teachers that just poured into him. He wanted to give up all the time, and he has developed grit through that process to continue, and we do X amount at home, but without that support at school, where a lot of that academics is happening, he would probably still be struggling, and he's not now.
Awesome.
And to see that process is just that quality, I guess, skill is something that will benefit him for the rest of his life.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts, Cyndy?
Well, I was just looking at the last standard and seeing tolerance for ambiguity, and
Yes.
There are a lot of students who want to be told exactly what to do, and well, what do I need to do to get an A?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the real world is not like that all the time, and sometimes you are given, these are the things that it needs to have, and other times you're given a couple of things and told, you need to figure out what else.
Yeah.
And our last project had that, and so I think students kind of learning how to build those criterion constraints themselves is super important, and have them start to analyze and, okay, well, what would an A look like? I'm not being told.
Yeah.
But what can I do?
Define it for themselves.
Yeah.
The thing that for me that kind of blew me away, and again I've been kind of geeking out for the last half hour, is how I really envisioned this standard as really connected to a really narrow band of learning or of content area around robotics and project-based learning and making and so on. And the fact that all of this stuff needs to be transferred across the subject areas, and not only to the soft skills, but also that design thinking and that idea of allowing failure to occur in the classroom. So that was cool. Really fantastic. Well, this has been a great conversation. Cyndy Hagin, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Mark Ray.
And this is Zach Desjardins.
And this has been EdTech Remix. See you next time.